Hello all, welcome back to Babylon is Burning, the talk show where we talk about issues in relation to digital culture. Today we have in our studio Sander de Ridder, who will talk about global sexual politics and digital media infrastructures. Welcome back to Babylon is Burning. Together with me in the studio is Sander de Ridder. Sander, I know you from sexting, not from sexting with you, but from your research on sexting, just to clarify. But you're not here to talk about sexting today, right? We're talking about something different.
Yes, I'm going to talk about something different. So I'm usually interested in a very broad sense in why digital media matter for people's sexualities. And recently I started studying mobile dating apps because I was in London and I noticed a lot of people there are actually using mobile dating apps, but also you see all kinds of advertisements of mobile dating apps in London, so they are very present and to some level normalized in people's everyday lives. And in my research I found that people to some degree are feeling that they are dependent on them to find intimate connections. So I started to look for mobile dating apps, what they mean on a global level. And then came some very disturbing news about Chechnya, who prosecuted LGBT people at a certain moment. Mm-hmm. And when human rights reports came out, they all reported that mobile dating apps were used to track down LGBT people.
Okay, so they played a role in the hunt for...
Yes, in the hunt for LGBT people in Chechnya. And so I became interested in this. I became interested in the question, how can we study and look at mobile dating apps and how they are used on a global level to think about worldwide struggles on sexual politics.
Okay, and what would be then sexual politics? It's a difficult concept. How can we make that more tangible?
Yeah, I think sexual politics for me refers to sexual rights, and sexual rights are about the opportunity people should have to express their sexuality freely, to consent to sexual activity. And at the moment on a global level there is a huge norm polarization, it is called, on sexual politics, where some states are really in favor for recognizing sexuality as part of human rights, and those illiberal democracies who see this call for recognition of sexual rights as a form of Western imperialism, actually.
Okay, as if it's kind of transposing our worldviews on these societies.
Absolutely. So mobile dating apps are also easy scapegoats and almost Western symbols for that kind of idea that sexuality is all about identity and free expression, and some governments in some countries simply don't accept that. And I brought an example of Indonesia. So as we can see, recently Indonesia banned the use of LGBT apps. What I find interesting as a researcher is that Google actually helped them in that ban, because they took those LGBT apps from the Android App Store in Indonesia, which I think is an interesting paradox, because we all know Google as a very open-minded company who actively promotes LGBT issues. As we can see on the picture on the left, they are very visible on prides. And well, it's something they also to some extent commercialize their LGBT politics.
So there's some tension here between the values that they propose as part of their corporate social responsibility programs and what they actually do in reality.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think it also shows how big these infrastructures have become. I call Google an infrastructure because they operate in local, national, and global context, but they also, to some extent, privatize people's opportunities for communication. And what happens when you block LGBT apps in certain countries? This has immediate social consequences for LGBT people on the ground in these countries. So you could ask, what is Google's responsibility? Should they actually obey to Indonesian law and then indeed block those apps, or should they put more emphasis on human rights, on sexual rights?
Okay, so in a sense you are calling for, I guess, more reflexivity on the part of the tech corporations who operate these infrastructures?
Yes.
Okay.
I want to make a call for more responsibility and thinking about this.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that, but first we take a break.
We'll return after these messages.
Men value women of 21. Okay? It doesn't matter how old they are, it's just 21 until it starts becoming creepy, and then they still value women of 21.
Welcome back to Babylon is Burning. We're talking to Sander de Ridder about global sexual politics, and you just said that big tech corporations are installing these infrastructures that shape how people experience dating and sexuality, of course. But for me, this seems to be also an issue of maybe propagating certain norms and values. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think platforms are neutral, so they imply certain ways in which people live their genders. They imply certain ways in which people live their sexualities. For example, platforms allow you to identify your sexuality and your gender in a certain way. This creates possibilities, but also closes down some other possibilities. But even more so is that these platforms are usually designed by Western designers working in Silicon Valley. They have certain ideas about what a sexual identity is, what a certain gender identity
Probably
is.
also closely related to societal transformations that are going on in the West as a result of Me Too evolutions, etc.
Yeah, a good example, for example, is Tinder, who in 2015 decided, Tinder is a mobile dating app, by the way, who decided to open up more gender categories on the platform because transgender people felt excluded, because there wasn't an option for transgender people to indicate their gender. So I brought an example of a commercial of Tinder who announced these new gender options. Let's maybe have a look.
There's not me and you. We are all the same.
That's going to allow all of us to connect with the people who we are most likely to have a strong connection with.
Everyone has the right to be who they are and meet someone great who loves them for who they are.
Okay, I thought Tinder was an app for hookups, not for finding love, but apparently I'm wrong.
Some people do find love on Tinder, but it's indeed true that they certainly in their marketing sell a certain idea of romanticism, and they sell a certain idea of love that is to some extent detached from people's experiences, because indeed Tinder can be seen as a hookup app. But what I think is more important is how Tinder is experienced in countries that aren't part of the West, because they are globally adopted. And often people in those countries do not recognize the idea of romance and love they are selling. They contain a lot of Western values. Also when it comes to the particular identity options, they showed in more countries who emphasize tradition and religion as very important. These identity categories are seen as Western values.
Okay, so if they would see trans feminine, would they know what is understood as being a trans feminine?
Well, of course, it depends on the people, but I would say on a political level, in these countries who emphasize traditional values, that this is seen as a form of Western imperialism, and then those mobile dating apps become a very easy scapegoat. Because of course Tinder means well, but it is also a commercial strategy to make this kind of advertisement, to open up these gender categories. Because of course if you talk to transgenders, people's experiences on Tinder, an identity category in the software changes something, but not everything. I mean, an experience is much more complicated than certain identity categories on the platform.
Okay, and so when you say that this can be, I don't know what the correct word would be, but sensitive in certain other cultures, does it then lead to real problems or real issues?
Well, I think it could on a political level, but then the most important question is, how is this then experienced for people? So like I said, I mean, these are questions on a political level of global sexual struggles, where those mobile dating apps are seen as scapegoats, as a form of Western imperialism. But there is some proof that people in certain countries aren't allowed to use mobile dating apps, like we've seen in the example of Indonesia, but also brought interesting research from a human rights organization, which is called Article 19, who did interviews with people on the use of LGBT dating apps in Egypt and Lebanon and in Iran. And I have some quotes from that research report. For example, someone is saying, I have heard of many cases where someone would get criminalized with the Lebanese Penal Code 534 just for the presence of mobile dating apps on their phone. Someone else in this report was saying, we are a lot more cautious to the huge restriction in the Iranian law, but in general it doesn't stop me. I continue to meet queer people on mobile dating apps. So what I find very interesting here is that for queer people in these countries, mobile dating apps are crucial communication infrastructure. They are crucial for the recognition of their sexual rights. They allow them to express their sexuality. They allow them to consent to sex. And so when a government threatens them, when they use them, when a government decides to block access to them, it is a sexual right infringement. It denies their sexual rights, I think.
We'll talk more about that, but we first take a short break.
We'll return after these messages.
Please subscribe to the Digit Magazine YouTube channel. You will not regret it.
Welcome back to Babylon is Burning, where we're talking to Sander de Ridder about global sexual politics and digital media infrastructures. And so we see that there are these tensions with these mobile dating apps and local cultures where they are oftentimes forbidden or misunderstood. But then what is the way forward? Because these are also questions about norms and values that maybe apps developed in the West propagate in perhaps an imperialistic manner. So should they be responsible for respecting local cultures? Or are these local cultures infringing on people's sexual rights, and should they rather be more open? What is the step forward here?
Well, I think what is very important to realize is whether companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, like it or not, they are such global important players that they have huge responsibilities. For example, a national government should protect people's human rights. But in some countries, in reality, this doesn't happen. But global digital media infrastructures have become such an important space for people to live their everyday lives, and also sexual aspects of their everyday lives, that they're undeniably important when it comes to actually protecting people's human rights. And this is, of course, a very difficult debate we are in, because this is questioning the responsibility of those apps. For example, when you look at the history of infrastructures, telecom infrastructures, although even when they were privately owned, like in the US, they had public service obligations. Now we have huge infrastructures who do not have any public service obligations. They are designed in Silicon Valley. They are often US companies. And their platforms are ideological in the sense that they communicate certain issues on sexuality, on gender. They make decisions all the time, and often as long as they stay within the West, as long as they stay within the US, they are safe. But when they go outside of that context, which often happens, they often meet resistance. And there we see a new struggle, a new conflict. And my main thing that I want to communicate is that we need to start understanding what is happening on the ground in the actual lives of people. That is why I showed the report from Article 19. We need to hear people's stories, and then we can start thinking and deciding on the responsibilities of these platforms in such human rights issues.
Because what we see is that even though they are banned, they are still being used. People find loopholes.
Yes, of course people will always find loopholes to use them, and in reality, in the everyday lives of people, things aren't looking so grim as the conflicts that exist on sexual rights on a global level. But still, I mean, if you want to think about digital media and digital culture, you should think about their responsibilities.
And how could a Silicon Valley company weigh on the debate? How could they do that?
Well, I don't think it's the task of Silicon Valley to weigh on such important debates on human rights. I think the United Nations and the Council of Europe can come up with ideas on how to deal with such issues of the huge responsibility they have. But of course, the power they now have, these big companies like Facebook, Google, and Apple, as a consequence of a very long deregulation of digital media market. And we have now come so far, and now the question is, are they responsible for these things? Usually the question should have been asked, I think, a very long time ago. But it's only now we see some of these issues rising.
Yeah, technological development precedes policy development.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, thinking back about your time in London, we've talked a lot about the parts of the world where these infrastructures operate differently than in the West. But so in the West, do you see issues there in terms of how these infrastructures operate and, let's say, infringement of sexual rights?
Not really sexual rights, but what I was struck by was that mobile dating apps are sometimes seen as something frivolous, something funny, something from popular culture. But I spoke to a lot of people who recently came to London to find a job or to study, and the simple truth is that they were 30-somethings feeling very lonely, and they were wondering how to connect with people in this global city. And so they started downloading mobile dating apps, and then they were confronted with issues of sexism, ghosting, all these annoying issues that come with mobile dating apps. They have a lot of wonderful opportunities, but they can also be, to some extent, annoying and very intensive in your everyday life. And despite all that, they to some extent felt dependent on that infrastructure to find intimate connections with people in that global city. And of course, that dependence is, rather than a functional dependence, a feeling. But it's nevertheless a very important feeling. And that made me think about how important they have become in our everyday lives. So yes, they are an infrastructure, and mobile dating apps are part of an even bigger infrastructure when you think about the fact that they are attached to the Google App Store and that they are attached to the Apple App Store. And then that is when I went to see how this plays out in global political and global sexual rights conflicts.
Okay, thank you, Sander, for this super interesting talk. I wish we could talk more, but we have to end here. So thank you for watching, and I really hope I see you also next time for our next episode when we will talk about female armpit hair.
I'm not afraid to get sand on my tuxedo if you're not afraid to let the wind mess your hair up a little bit when I take the top down.